what exactly is sexual addiction, and how does that differ from other types of sexual behavior or compulsion?
I would say sex addiction, particularly. I mean, there's probably about 10 things, 10 sort of symptomologies, if you think about that with that sense, that we would look for as far as what makes sex addiction kind of sex addiction in that sense. And
Yeah, so I guess if you find yourself using it as a coping mechanism versus just being more sexually active, I was just trying to see where do you draw the line between that.
and usually where, what defines healthy versus unhealthy sex. That's kind of the big thing. And the way I always think about it, at least this is kind of the way maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but for me, it's the way I kind of think about it is it sex with myself?
Welcome to American GypC Podcast. I'm your host, Gypsy, and today I have a special guest, Patrick Eiler. He is a licensed professional counselor, a certified life coach, and a certified sexual addiction therapist. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Hi, Gypsy. Thank you so much for having me on today. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, glad to have you on. Can you give us a little bit about your background and what drew you to focusing on sexual addiction?
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Patrick Eilers, and I am a licensed professional counselor, as Gypsy mentioned. And so I've been a professional counselor for about 8 years now in the field of mental health. And so I started working in the field back in 2016. And really, when I started working in the field, I basically worked with kind of the general population. If you think about it as a general therapist, I was working with kind of mostly anybody and everyone as far as diagnosis is concerned, or just some of the people that I saw. If my youngest client was 5, oldest client was 62, so somewhere in that range. I kind of worked with everybody. So I had a lot of different experiences kind of early in my career. So the first couple of years, like I said, just kind of worked as a general practitioner, and then had the opportunity to really the opportunity to switch my license from I was used to be a psychologist to a professional counselor. And in most cases, that's mostly just a title change, but I had to do some stuff for school and things like that. So I went back to school for a short period of time. Worked well, I worked for a while. I worked as a job evaluation specialist, which is a whole different job. But for a bit of time, I worked as a uh, can't think of the name. Professor for a couple of the universities over in this area, Concordia University, Ann Arbor, and Jackson College here in the Michigan area. And so I was an intro psych professor for a short period of time. Then I had an opportunity to work in another city in our area, Lapeer, Michigan, which is again kind of outside Detroit area for those who are familiar with our location. And during that time, I had an opportunity to work at a startup clinic, which is really cool, kind of general practitioner again, but mostly from the ground up, which was something I always wanted to do. I had been part of some other things in the past that were more established, so getting a chance to kind of create our own culture was really cool. So I worked there for about a year and a half, and as we started kind of gaining some ground, and the pandemic happened. Pandemic kind of sort of more or less kind of split us apart, and we were able to kind of gain some ground there. So I left there and had an opportunity to come to where I'm currently at, North Point Professional Counseling, and that's in Novi, again, kind of suburbs of Detroit area. And so being at North Point, we specialize in sex addiction and partner betrayal trauma. So the main reason I came there was part of it is because I was looking for something a little different, and to kind of try my hand at the specialty area. And it's like when you work in other areas in other fields, the more you specialize, the more likely you can kind of gain a footing as far as a clientele or a client base, that kind of way. So I've been doing that for the last 4 years. This is actually my fourth year at North Point, and we run an outpatient recovery program. So basically, it's a inpatient program, so similar to like a substance abuse kind of program, but an outpatient in the outpatient model. So people can still live their lives and do their things they typically would. They just have it's just a program that we follow, kind of a roadmap, if you can think about it that way. So I've been there for 4 years, and like I said, nothing necessarily initially drew me into wanting to work with sex addiction. At least from the beginning of my career, I wasn't particularly planning to work with sex addiction necessarily, but this is an area that has been on the rise for folks. Continues to be on the rise with how our culture is changing, with how things are changing, with the way we date, with the way we interact with the internet, the way we interact with one another. And so pornography has become something that's particularly a main focus of what we do, just because so many people are struggling with it. So So that's an area really where kind of I landed, and that's sort of when I said that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 4 years. So enjoy it. There's some things that you always learn a lot working with different folks, but one of the things I guess it's a bit of a challenge with it too is sometimes is that there are a lot of cases that it can be very well, I wouldn't say cases so much, but just the continual process in the recovery program can be a little bit of a burnout. There's sometimes it's just a lot to try to accomplish, and sometimes it's what can feel like a short period of time, even though the program itself is somewhat long. It's sometimes like 3 to 5 years for most folks. So, a lot of these clients we work with are pretty long-term clients that we spend time with. So, that's kind of an overview of what I've been doing the last 4 years and kind of some of the things I've done.
And what exactly is sexual addiction, and how does that differ from other types of sexual behavior or compulsions?
Yeah,
Like,
so I would say sex addiction particularly. I mean, there's probably about 10 things, 10 sort of symptomologies if you think about in that with that sense that we would look for as far as what makes sex addiction kind of sex addiction in that sense. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are a couple that would be really standing out. And the one of them would be the amplification of the behavior. So like I'll use porn as their example. If I watch porn and I find myself watching more and more porn and it takes up more and more of my life and more of my time to the point that I may have a hard time functioning just because I'm spending so much time watching pornography and masturbating and kind of doing those things. So that's one area I'd say. The other thing that we look for would be like kind of did people have an early exposure in their life? So if they are 4, 5, 6, 7 years old and they have some type of exposure to pornography, it doesn't always mean that they're going to become an addict, but there's a lot of times people usually get kind of caught by that curiosity, and there's just kind of more and more wanting to learn more about that and those kind of things. So that's one area. Another area we look for. A lot of folks that usually struggle with addiction have some type of a rigid background. So their family members or their family of origin is very strict on especially sex as a topic, but other topics too, but specifically sex. They don't really talk much about sex. It's kind of a taboo topic. It's an area that people are not really familiar with in that sense in those settings. So we usually see those people, folks like that, being pretty strong candidates for struggling with sex addiction of that in that sense. And kind of back to your earlier question, what's one thing that's a little bit different about it from substance use is that sex addiction, much like food addiction or video games or those kind of more behavioral type addictions, are what they call process addictions. And so they don't necessarily have a chemical component so much, meaning that you ingest the chemical and then that gives you that experience. They're more of behavioral behavioral addictions that help you stay away from other emotions that you might be struggling with or dealing with or navigating internally. So what typically happens is that there's more of an association with sex and food and those kind of things with other things in life because we are sexual beings. We do need food, etc. But those things are typically more along the lines of behaviors that we do, and we kind of get them out of balance, and so they just end up affecting my life to the point that I'm not able to function anymore. So again, there's probably different ways people might think about that and some of those words. There's what I always think about is balance, and so what are we thinking about in our lives? What's our mindset during a time that we're experiencing these behaviors? Because a lot of times the reason that the behavior continues is because you spend a lot of time fantasizing and a lot of time thinking about other times, other opportunities when you can watch porn or act out or do whatever as far as that behavior goes. So hopefully that answers to your question, but it's kind of hard to explain necessarily from a perspective of what's vastly different from it, but sex is the vessel that people are using rather than necessarily the substance that they might use, like with alcohol or drugs.
yeah, so I guess if you find yourself using it as a coping mechanism versus just being more sexually active, I was just trying to see where do you draw the line between that.
Yeah, and usually where what defines healthy versus unhealthy sex. That's kind of the big thing. And the way I always think about it, at least this is kind of the way maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but for me, it's the way I kind of think about it is it sex with myself? Is it sex that's about me, or is it sex about my relationship? Is it partner oriented, partner driven? Now, there are some things that can be conventional that can be unhealthy. So, like if you had somebody who wanted to have sex with their partner, 12 times a day, and they just weren't able to control themselves in that aspect, again, what does that look like? That would probably be a very specific circumstance. But in those cases, those would be something that could be unhealthy. But just as much as on the other side of it, somebody who's engaging in other unhealthy behaviors that maybe harming someone else in that sense, and those could be abuse scenarios or things like that. Um, Now, again, not all sex addicts or people who struggle with sexual addiction are struggling with pedophilia, which I think is a common sort of um, uh, it's one of the things that we kind of sort of have in our culture. There's a stigma to what that is. It's a stigma to what sex addiction is, and that's not people who struggle with pedophilia doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a sex addict and vice versa. And I don't know a lot about sexual pedophilia in that sense because I don't work mostly with folks like that. But when you're struggling with sex addiction, I think that's one of the stigmas that people typically navigate. They feel like, okay, well, I'm going to get kind of labeled in that way when there's not, doesn't mean that that's how they're going to behave in that sense. So that's just one thing I like telling people because it is something that we seem to have as a culture. It's a bit stigmatism attached to it in that sense.
And I'm guessing, like other addiction, there's an underlying issue or trigger that, you know, gets people on this path. So what are some of the common underlying issues to be aware of?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones I run into, and it's a kind of a combination of a lot of different things that kind of come together. But I would say one of the big ones is, belief system about themselves. It's a pretty big one. If you think you're unattractive, if you think you're not going to be able to be worth, someone's time, or that you can be in a relationship, etc. Those belief systems usually play a pretty big role in how a person thinks about themselves. That leads to a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of negative image, body image, those kind of things. And so then that just sort of feeds into that loop of, I can just isolate and stay by myself and watch porn and be safe. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier, having sex with yourself. That's a very emotionally safe place, right? I can't always be vulnerable in that sense to anybody. So that's a pretty big one. Another one is that I find a lot of times that people, especially if they're younger, like so most of the people who struggle with porn that I work with are usually between like 20 and 40 in that age range. Um, so again, boredom's a pretty big one. When people are bored, they don't have something that they're passionate about in their life. They don't have something that they're moving toward. It's a pretty big deterrent for them to stay sober in that sense. So that can be one. People typically who are struggling also, I mean, some have had some type of an abuse part of their story, but I wouldn't say it's super common. I'd say it can happen, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily what the average person would struggle with. It seems like younger folks, their exposure is very early because of the internet, and so because that exposure is early, it's a lot safer to watch porn than it is to go out and date now, especially with the way the dating culture is. And so there's kind of a piece there I think that plays a pretty big role. And again, some of that is self image, definition, those kind of things. But it's also some of it could be that's a coping skill like we talked about earlier it's safer for them to do that than for them to necessarily go be vulnerable and risk being hurt in a dating sense or in a relationship. So those are a couple of things I'd say are pretty big, contributors to it. I think also the fact that again, if you consistently do something over and over again, it just becomes your habit, it becomes your normal, and so that's pretty big for people too. That they do this behavior over and over again. It's the most powerful for them, and because it has a strong drive to us to go back to it, and our body and mind likes to do the same thing over and over again. It doesn't like to try things new, so to speak. So when that happens, people are more likely to continue down that path of same behavior over and over again.
Mm. So it makes sense that you focused on it during the pandemic. So it seems like low self-esteem and isolation plays a big part in it and how the media portrays sex and sexuality. Um, since this is more of a behavioral addiction, like what are some things that people can do, a person can be proactive and do by themselves to kind of shift away from this behavior?
Yeah, well, and a lot of people, just my experience, a lot of people will come in and that's the first thing, they want to stop behavior and they kind of want to move forward. That's usually the first part that they want to do, right? I want to end doing this, I want to end watching porn and whatever unhealthy behavior I'm doing, and I want to move forward. And ultimately, that's a great goal. We want to encourage that, but there are things as far as behavioral things, you have to sort of start to do to move to what they call a second order change, which is the second, which is kind of like a transformational change, right? It's not just doing things like putting web blockers up and those kind of, I mean, that's a good start, but you have to then find those deeper things that kind of are causing the underlying roots of why things are continuing. So, like for example, one of the first things I always start people out with is, the phone doesn't need to be in the bathroom or the bedroom. Like that's an immediate change you can make today. Keep the phone out of the bathroom and the bedroom. All that creates is opportunity. Even if you have no desire to go act out or desire to watch porn or desire to do anything like that, while you're in either of those places, it's all opportunistic. So eliminate opportunities in that sense. So again, putting together like a basket, like a garage, so to speak, for all the phones in the home or the electronic devices to go at night is a good first step, right? So it's something you can do today, kind of thing. Beyond that, I think the next things are, you have to start doing some of the internal work for yourself and understanding why you're using this as something to escape. Typically, most people will use it to escape or to numb their feelings. So the way I think about numbing feelings is that, there's so many colors in your life, and the only way to get the colors to tune down is to do something that's going to make those colors less, which is hyper focus on fantasy, which is really the video games or porn, those kind of things. And I want to put those too much together, but they are pretty common. They do have a common correlation with each other. So one of the big things is trying to, again, eliminate doing the same things I've been doing. So again, going, the more exercise I get, that's a huge thing. We always talk a lot about that as a society, right? Getting more physical exercise, going for walks, doing those kind of things, getting good sleep. We always talk about that as another one. Those are pretty good, pretty common immediate steps you can take. But the longer term things are, doing things like journaling, learning how to journal. One of the things I found with a lot of the guys I work with are people struggle in knowing how to journal. A lot of times you don't want to necessarily free associate, meaning you just don't want to write things down that come to your mind. You want to have a goal for the journal. So what is my journal? What do I want to get out of it? What do I want to learn from it? And have those questions kind of prompting me to go there. There's a lot of really great journals out there online you can get from like Amazon that are kind of already pre-made, pre-prompted. So those are helpful. So doing those kind of things. So journaling, meditating is a big piece. Doing the things that help you relax, help you feel like you're refilling your bucket, so to speak. I always think about, everybody's got a 5-gallon bucket sort of emotions in their life, right? And so when stress comes, the water in that bucket gets higher and higher and higher. For a lot of people who don't have maybe healthy coping skills, that bucket always reaches the top of the water. The water reaches the top of the bucket there. And then when we do something unhealthy, it's like, you put your put your hand in the water and just enough water spills out of it until there's only this much space of where there's water between the water and the top of the bucket. And so when stress comes again, and that it's just going to overflow. So I'm gonna keep going back to those unhealthy behaviors because they don't really lower my water in the bucket, so to speak, unless I put a drain at the bottom of the bucket and slowly, bring water down in the bucket, even though if there's stress still coming from the top, I'm still consistently lowering that water. So what's important is the healthy coping skills are those things that do lower the water. It's the hobbies in my life. It's the being able to meditate. It's the goals I have long term. All those kind of things are healthy to start moving me with less stress, so I don't feel like I'm so overwhelmed all the time. Because stress is going to happen, and we have to accept that part of it. But being able to be focused on how to be able to lower that water, I think, is a pretty significant piece. And so, going back to like you said, there's some things with not only the meditation, but like the long-term goals, the hobbies, connecting with people is huge. We talked about that earlier, being isolated. If I'm isolated, I'm not gonna have an opportunity to really connect with anybody. I'm not gonna have an opportunity to really grow. I'm not gonna have an opportunity to really be feeling like I'm part of a community. The more isolated you are, the more likely you're going to be the one that's going to kind of be targeted in that sense. And like, sort of from like a spiritual warfare perspective, you're going to be the one that's isolated from the community. So, being part of a community is huge. So those are some things I say just kind of off the top of my head that I say is, immediate stuff people can do pretty quickly to start to change those behaviors and implement those boundaries in their life.
I've heard people say I have an addictive personality in terms of, easily susceptible to addictions. Do you feel like, are there people that are more susceptible to addictions?
Well, I certainly think that people who have grown up around addictions are more likely to see that be some of their behavior. So, so an example would be, like whatever your norm is, going back to whether it be substance or whether it be behavioral, A lot of folks that struggle with sex addiction, but I would say probably is true for other addictions as well, come from family of origin who has had addiction in their life. So there's a lot of generational type of addiction that happens because that's kind of what is expected. That's what the norm, that's what this means, those kind of things. So with sex addiction specifically, if grandpa had magazines around or had pornographic material around, then dad learns that that's okay and hides that from mom. Then what's my message when I see dad having the magazines hidden from mom? Well, the message is I can do that and that's perfectly okay and there's nothing wrong with it, kind of thing. So I might start watching porn. And then eventually does that then translate to my children? So there is some pieces of that I think are very much true. Does that mean that people can't break the cycle? They absolutely can. But breaking the cycle means that there's sometimes a lot of hard work that goes into that breaking the cycle. It doesn't come easy. And again, that's true for anything that's out of balance in our life. It takes time and intention to be able to break from that. One of the things I find it seems like with people who struggle with consistent behavior, no matter where they're at, is that it feels very organic. And I use that word to describe that it doesn't take a lot of effort for me to think about the things I just enjoy doing, right? The things I just consistently do. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to think about going and brushing my teeth. I don't have to think about necessarily going to how do I even drive to work and those kind of things. And that's because the brain, it knows what to do over and over again because it creates neural pathways that are very consistent. So once those are kind of in place, it's very easy for me to be very organic feeling. It doesn't take a lot of effort. But everything that takes a lot of work for me to grow in almost always takes intentionality. I would say 99% of the time takes intentionality. And if I'm intentional, that means I'm doing something that goes against the way my brain has already mapped its sort of way of living out. Like it has to go down a different pathway and that has to be generated and created over a period of time. That's why it takes a little while for us to build new habits. So when we build new habits, we have to build that actually physical pathway in our brain in order for that to be able to be maintained behavior. And that varies. I know there's different research out there that says it's somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks. Some people say it's from the sex addiction perspective, it's usually about 90 days. So again, it's kind of a 3 month period for that to kind of get ready to reset. But what I always tell people is that, just because your brain's kind of reset and you're using a new pathway doesn't mean those old pathways go away. They're still physically present. They're just like dormant. They aren't being used. So that's why it's easy to fall back in old behaviors again, because those pathways are already there. They're already established. They're already mapped out. And because the brain likes to do the same thing over and over again, it likes to jump back on those pathways. And that's true for all behavior, but addiction seems to be particularly strong in that for that because there's so much power in the temporary relief with addiction, specifically with sex addiction.
Mm. And how important is it to seek help, professional help, versus dealing with it on your own?
Well, I think the couple big things about seeking professional help and kind of the in between professional help and like community groups and those kind of things. I mean, I definitely encourage people if they're struggling with some kind of behavior that is compulsive and they're using it over and over again. The first best thing you can do is to get involved in some type of a 12 step or some type of community group that supports and has helped be part of that. That's a major part of why people find success is because they have other people that they can relate to, they can talk to, they can hear each other's story, and it helps them to stay on the path. So 12 steps, just like AA, there's SA. SAA is another one. Sex Addicts Anonymous is SAA, and then SLAA, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Those are all 12-step programs. More of a theological background one is one called Celebrate Recovery, which are at different churches that are in around the country. So that's another one. And then the next part about, from seeking professional help, I think the biggest thing is to look for somebody who has worked with what they call the CSAT community, so the certified sex addiction therapists. Those folks can really help you map that out, whether or not it's an addiction or not an addiction. We have access to what they call a sexual dependency inventory, which is an online assessment that we give to people that gives us a kind of a print off of kind of their sexual history. And we can kind of look at, what are some criteria that they may be meeting for symptomologies of addiction. If you just go to a general practitioner, which is perfectly okay to do that, they will probably take a lot longer to get kind of down to what that looks like for you because they're not as able to identify some of those symptoms as quickly. Mainly because when you're struggling with addiction, there's a lot of other symptoms that usually are present. Anxiety, depression, sometimes suicidal ideation is part of that. Just because the person's life is so unmanageable. And it depends on how far that is. Sometimes people's life, you can be a functioning alcoholic, you could be a functioning sex addict, absolutely. I'd say argue probably you could be more likely a functioning sex addict because people are usually in denial. They don't think it's that big of an issue. It's not really causing any problems for them that they see. They usually keep it in secret. It ruins a lot of relationships. Betrayal trauma is a real thing. And a lot of the people I've navigated, I've been with and talked to and heard different stories. I mean, betrayal trauma can really do a lot of damage to a relationship just because it erodes trust. And when there's no trust, you're not going to be able to move forward together. It's very difficult to do that. So definitely recommend usually both part if you're in a relationship and you're struggling with that, then usually it ends up becoming a relational thing. And so both partners, unfortunately, very unfairly to both, but certainly unfair to the partner who's been betrayed, they're both going to need to probably work on each other while they're in the midst of kind of working on the relationship because it usually taints the relationship in that sense.
In those cases, do you work with both partners or?
I personally don't, but I know there are a lot of therapists who do. So if you're looking for somebody who deals with or works with partner trauma, those therapists are what they call ABSATs. So or I think it's I always get this wrong, but I think it's ABSATs. So they're basically a certification for partner betrayal trauma, and so they work specifically with partners who navigate very similar to PTSD symptoms and it goes across the board if it's for male, female, both sides. It seems like when there's a betrayal, it brings these type of symptoms to the partner who's been betrayed. And so there's a loss of, being able to trust. There's a loss of security in the relationship. They're always hyper vigilant. They're always looking for when people are lying. They always feel like they're being even if there's no lying going on, they believe there's lying going on because they see similar symptoms or similar behavior, even when there's not lying going on. So that's very common for partners and relationships to deal with that when there's been a betrayal.
Do
But
you
there are therapists to get. So I realized it didn't answer your question. There are therapists who work with both at the same time. Yes, I'm not one of them, but there are therapists who do.
In your experience, is there a difference in how it presents itself in the different genders or how they experience it?
The betrayal trauma or just the addiction
Well, the
itself?
sexual addiction itself, is there any difference in how it presents itself with different genders or?
Yeah, I haven't worked it with any female sex addictions or sex addicts since I've just because typically, I mean, again, I do have colleagues who have when in our practice, the practice I work at, we do have people who have worked with female sex addiction. So I know it is out there, and I would actually say it's probably on the rise a little bit. The biggest thing I think is the difference. I'd say that if it just was to make a general understanding difference, is that for most women, it's not going to probably look as much like pornography, though I do think that's on the rise as well. Don't have any stats for you, but I just overall feeling that the sense that probably is a little bit on the rise. But for females, it usually looks a little more like compulsive relationships. So kind of relationship after relationship after relationship. What they call kind of the cosmic lover. You're looking for that perfect person. It's going to check all the boxes and everything, kind of all the fantasy you've kind of built in your mind. They're gonna meet all those criteria. Now, men absolutely 100% have the same problem. That's not something that's just exclusive to females. But I would say that for men, usually that's much more of usually the deeper thing to the porn. So the porn sort of serves as that basis for where you're building that off of. So your cosmic lover is kind of based on the porn you're watching, and you're looking for that kind of person out, sort of out in public, and you'll probably never find that person because it's a specific type of fantasy. It's probably not there. So now, but I said like females, it probably is a little more based on that. Other area where I'd say it's kind of or potentially could be a larger issue would be erotic literature, though a lot of men are into that too. But certainly, like a lot of the books that are related to like uh, uh, the Gray series. I can't think of the name of it right now, but like 50 Shades of Gray, those kind of things. Like a lot of those type of literature books and those things that could be maybe one of the symptoms you would look for too, or would be part of that. Doesn't guarantee it, but certainly could be part of that.
Mm. Are there any strategies you use to help clients um, to prevent relapse or long-term coping mechanism?
Well, some of the things we mentioned earlier would be part of it. When you're establishing a sobriety, really it's about creating this idea of what are you going to what's your number one, what behaviors are you not doing? So as first you identify that, and usually that engages more than just pornography and masturbation. You'd put in there in that circle typically, or in that category, you would talk about maybe what they call rubbernecking, which is like taking the second, third, fourth look at the person that you notice in public. So that's a lot of those kind of objectifying type behaviors. So there's that. A behavior they call cruising, which is a behavior kind of online we see mostly, where I'm looking like at things that are not meant to be sexual, but kind of are sexual, and they kind of get me excited. And so then that kind of leads me into more deeper pornography. So there's that behavior. Those are probably two of the more common ones we put in that. So identifying those, and again, learning how to thought break. Really the biggest thing is taking the steps to not allow the thought to continue down the path of fantasy. So as soon as the thought goes from, hey, I noticed that person, making sure I'm breaking from that, what a tool that we use is called like ABC. So awareness, break, and then the last one is compassion. So you have compassion for yourself or for the person that you're noticing. So you try to rehumanize them. So you're not looking at them as an object, you're looking at them as a person. Sometimes that can also be looking at them in their role, right? Are they a mom, a sister, a daughter, a wife? There's some role, kind of rehumanizing them in that way. So those are some different like thought breaking tools to try to think more or be more aware of your own thought life and being aware. And then another one I would use that I always encourage people is like, and we're in the NFL season now. So for guys, a lot of people are into football, and I was, go through all the divisions in football. Think about there's four divisions, there's four teams in each division. So it's pretty easy to remember all of the teams. And by the time you're done with the 32 teams, you probably don't remember what it was you were thinking about before, because you're kind of breaking from that over a period of time. So those are some thought breaking kind of techniques we would teach. And then the relapse part, or the slip part, which should be kind of our second circle, is identifying places and situations and circumstances for which relapse can occur. So again, I talked about earlier, phone's not in the bathroom or the bedroom. If you struggle with a strip club, don't go drive by where the strip club is. If you struggle with online behaviors with certain websites like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all the social medias, get off social media for 6 months to a year, take a hiatus on that. Doesn't mean you won't be off there permanently. And for some people it might, but for most people it's just, just kind of hit the reset with it a little bit. Kind of get away from the algorithm, because the algorithm feeds that, same kind of thing. It's going to feed a lot of those same things you're liking or looking at. Avoiding places where I know, or avoiding situations. Now, one of the things that sometimes people will do, and I want to just mention this as I'm talking about it, but sometimes people will want to try to avoid everything, and you can't do that either, right? That's the other side of the extreme. So there has to be a balance between, knowing the certain circumstances where it's much worse than others. So a big one that comes up is the beach. People are always like, well, I can never go to the beach again. Well, you can go to the beach, just don't go to the beach on spring break in Florida on, try to stay away from that time. But, go to the quiet beach, go to the beach where there's less people, go where there's more retirees or something. Like, there's ways you can do that. You're just not going to be able to do it as conventionally as you would have before. So those are some examples of some of the second type of behaviors. And we look for a second circle. That's what they call a slip behavior. Then the third circle is really identifying those long-term positions. What kind of man do you want to be? What kind of goals do you have? It has to be more specific than just, I want to be a better husband, or I want to be a better boyfriend, or I want to be somebody who doesn't watch porn. Like, it's got to be more specific than that. It has to be things that you can actually visualize. One of the things that they're finding more in the research is that, and this isn't necessarily addiction specific, but it's just across the board about our brains, is that if we can close our eyes and imagine that we can get to whatever that is, see ourselves doing that. So I'll use football in our analogy. If I'm a quarterback and I'm going to learn how to be a better quarterback than I was, and I want to work at my passes, and I want to work at my ability to be able to be aware of the game and those kind of things, I need to be able to close my eyes and imagine myself in that scenario and play that out and continue to play that out the way I want it to go. Now, it's not going to manifest into that, but it's going to allow me to put myself emotionally in that space so that when I'm ready to do that and when I'm ready to have opportunity, I'll be able to step into it. So that's kind of the same idea with sobriety. My sobriety has to be something that I'm going to achieve. It has to be something I want to get to. It can't just be something that I just say, oh yeah, I want to get there eventually. If I say that, probably never going to get to it. So it has to be something I can close my eyes and sort of see that and know that this is how it's going to go for me and continue to practice that every day to get there. The other thing about sobriety, people sometimes always, or sometimes will feel like, is that once they've achieved it, it's like they've crossed the finish line and they're good to go. It once you never really cross the finish line, so to speak. It's kind of an ever moving target. You just keep getting better, or you keep getting worse. There's two ways you can go there. Now, I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that once you're an addict, always an addict, simply because what we talked about earlier, those brain pathways are always going to be in our brain. So we're always going to have some component to it. But if we're not doing healthy behavior, then we're not going to be consistently getting better. And so that's where I lean to more of that, is that if I stop doing the things that were healthy for me, it's just like eating, same kind of thing. If I stop eating healthy food and I start eating junk, I'm going to be unhealthy. No matter if that means that, I gain weight or I just, my internal organs are unhealthy, going to be unhealthy. So I got to keep doing the same healthy things over and over again and make that my lifestyle, not make it temporary, which a lot of times I think people feel like sobriety is a temporary piece.
You mentioned earlier uh, sometimes upbringing, especially when there's one extreme or another, can be a can make a person susceptible to these things. Are there things parents can do to mitigate that, uh, or change that, whether it's talking about it, if it's a restrictive environment, or are there any strategies for that?
Yeah, I do think and again, I'm not a parenting expert, so I don't know what the parenting people would say, but I know there certainly is an aspect of, what conversations are we having with kids that are age appropriate.
Mm.
So that's one area. Certainly if you have an adolescent, starting, early teenage years, I'd even say before that, at this point, with the way the internet is, 9, 10 years old probably is a conversation that have to be had around, look, this is why the internet is not a, is this is why the internet is safe and this is why the internet is unsafe, and kind of having that very differentiation reason why the internet potentially could be concerns for them. Obviously that conversation continues to grow into more of, okay, if you're going to start dating, this is what this looks like. This is, having some of those kind of conversations. One of the things I've heard quite a bit about lately, I've seen some different things online about, is having parents having more conversations with anatomically correct. I'm going to stumble with this. And basically your anatomy, having the right anatomy language,
Yep.
using the right terms for your anatomy, because that really sort of, again, takes away some of the mystery, takes away some of the ability to, make that, very, very specific, so that when you learn as a kid that this is the technical term for what I'm going to learn in school, because that's what I'm going to learn in school anyway, potentially if I have like a health course. But I need to have that be consistent, because if I learn it's this thing over here and it's kind of a slang term versus what it actually is, that's just, there's inconsistency there. So I think with kids, obviously consistency is a big thing, and maintaining that consistency is huge. So definitely for that sake, I think would be a really good thing. Again, age appropriate, but certainly in that range where, some of the kids, and this is just because the way the internet's been going, 6, 7 years old, 8 years old. I mean, that's something that they can have an early exposure to. And so, you're never going to be able to fully, and I say this to people I talk about a lot, is that, you're never going to be able to block everything that's ever on the computer. It's just not possible. Something will leak through, something will change, there'll be an ad, whatever the case is. There's something there, you're not going to be able to block it. So we just got to be prepared for when those times come up, because you just got to navigate it. You can't totally stay, unless you just totally stay off the internet, which at this point I don't think is a reasonable thing that can happen. We just need to navigate what's going to come up. And so I think trying to eliminate a little bit of the stigma, trying to eliminate some of the fear, really can help, parents, and also help kids, know, okay, hey, this is just some stuff to expect. It's not to scare you. It's not to put you in a position where you're going to be punished or things like that. Obviously, it depends on kind of where you stand as a parent, but certainly the idea that, like, if you're not having those conversations, the more curiosity could go up. And again, it doesn't mean that your child's going to struggle with sex addiction at all. But it does mean that, curiosity is one of those, like, sort of, if you think about a domino, it could be one domino that falls. Doesn't mean it's going to knock any more other ones down, but certainly could start that, questioning. And if kids don't feel comfortable talking to their parents about, specifically about sex, but really anything, those are going to be the areas that they're not going to really grow close with their parents. They may talk about everything else but sex. And there's a lot of parents who are like that. They don't have a lot of closeness even in that sense of talking about or asking questions or whatnot. So there is that aspect where there's got to be balance, but I think that can be a healthy balance in a good way, as long as those conversations are being had.
Yeah, I think the trick is, I guess, like you said, to reframe the thought as it comes up, because with the way society and media set up, it's really hard to avoid these things because sex sells, apparently.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that comes up. And I was on a podcast not long ago. We were talking about that in regards to just the things that are not meant to be sexual that are sexualized. I mean, Instagram is full of it. I mean, all you gotta do is hit the magnifying glass and you'll see it. And it's stuff that's not even, it's hiking, it's baking, it's cooking, it's whatever. And it's all these things that are not intended to be sexual that are sexualized. And so that is changing the way that people, identify with sex and understand sex. And I think it moves that needle further and further into the land of fantasy, where what is reality? People don't really know what that even is. So when you end up when you're in a relationship, the expectation is incredibly high on both parties. And then on the other side of that, then what happens when that fantasy isn't met, or what happens when that fantasy is said no to, or what happens when that fantasy is met with resistance? Um, then the relationship doesn't go, the relationship is looked at very negatively because it didn't meet expectations. And so all this sexualized social media, all it's doing is creating unrealistic expectations for things to be in a space that can never, it's never going to be able to be met because it's not real. And so that's one of the things I think that has been the real downfall of social media. And there's a lot of great things about the internet, about social media, and about what people have learned and way people connect and et cetera. But there's a lot of things that have really ruined it, and that's one of those areas. It's just the ability to create and you see that with even just like people know's lives. Like how does this person going on these trips and doing this thing, and then makes me compare myself to them and those kind of things. You also expand that out into sexuality. Now I'm comparing myself against this person or that person. I don't look like this person's body, and that goes both ways for men and for women. And men don't talk about it, but that's another one of those things that is sort of under wraps in that. But certainly a big part of why social media has become something that's definitely unhealthy in a lot of ways. If too much consumed, I think is probably the best way to put that.
Especially if your mental health is not up to par.
Your mental health to be challenged for sure, even if you if you're healthy or unhealthy, it would definitely be challenged.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and your valuable insight. Is there anything you want to leave the listeners with before we close it out?
Absolutely. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me or kind of follow me, I do have some elements of social media available. I do have a LinkedIn. Patrick Eilers, LPCMA, CSAP. That is probably the best way to get a hold of me through LinkedIn. I do have an Instagram. It's rated underscore PGE is my Instagram. Right now, it's the only thing I have so far for my contacts, but. You can always reach us as well. The website for our practice is northpoint-counseling.com. We also, you can also reach me there as well. So those are some few places to get a hold of me if you're interested.
And for the listeners, I'll have Patrick's information in the description as well as ours. If you'd like to be on the show, you can email americangypsy@gmail.com. Thank you, Patrick, for being on the show. And for the listeners, thank you for listening. Peace.